I'm going to talk about two issues in particular today. The first is vote caging and how it's been used to suppress minority votes. And second, I'm going to talk about the Justice Department.
Yeah, would you turn your mic on or speak into it, one or the other?
And second, I'm going to talk about the Justice Department's failure to enforce many of the provisions, not only of the Voting Rights Act, but other federal statutes that should be designed to protect the right to vote. Vote caging, in this context, involves sending out non-forwardable or registered mail to targeted groups of voters and compiling caging lists of voters for those whose mail is unable to be delivered. And although the NVRA prohibits election officials from canceling voter registration merely because a piece of mail has been returned, political operatives, primarily in the GOP, have used these type of tactics and lists, called caging lists, for many years. They've been enjoined time and time again by federal courts in caging operations that have challenged thousands of minority and urban voters nationwide on the basis of returned mail. To bring these types of schemes to an end will require vigorous prosecution by the Justice Department, but this Justice Department's priorities have shifted over the years, and I ought to know because I spent 21 years there and I was the acting chief of the Voting Rights Section for a number of them. The current administration has not only ignored voting caging schemes, but has actively worked, as I think the chairman pointed out in Ohio, to actually give vote caging schemes a boost in the federal courts by actually defending them in Ohio. Now, I know that I have limited time today, so I'm going to talk in particular about a couple of things. I think Mr. Watt and perhaps Mr. Scott and Mr. Ellison asked questions about what the Justice Department has done in trying to get a straight answer about, well, are there any voting caging schemes under investigation right now? And, you know, Mr. Agarwal's testimony this morning is that he wasn't aware, as I recall what he said, of a single instance or an investigation even being conducted. So how could they possibly know at the Justice Department if there's been any illegality in these voting schemes if they haven't done any investigations of them? I mean, that's just basic law enforcement 101. With regard to vote caging schemes, I personally have written letters to the Justice Department bringing to their attention instances in which minority voters have been targeted by political operatives, and we don't know who. They could be Democrats, they could be Republicans. But black voters in Dallas, Texas in 2006, after Mr. Agarwal joined the Justice Department, received a letter that said, if you were registered by Acorn, they're a fraudulent organization, and if you try to vote, you will be prosecuted and arrested at the polls. Justice Department hasn't even investigated that matter, even though it was brought to their attention. And there are other examples that I could get to along those same lines. And to suggest that the Justice Department didn't know about the Tim Griffin vote caging scheme, they must have had their head in the sand, because everybody knew about that. It was reported on the BBC years ago. And there's a book out about it. So it's just incredulous for somebody to assert that. With regard to the Department's enforcement of basic laws that are supposed to expand the right to vote, look at the NVRA. The NVRA, the Motor Voter Bill, was enacted primarily to get more people, to make it easier for people to register to vote. Its primary purpose wasn't to purge voting lists. But what the Department of Justice has done, and Mr. Agarwal again says, oh, since 2006, we filed 5 cases to enforce the NVRA. Well, 4 of them have been to purge people, and 1 of them have been to increase voter registration for people who are receiving public benefits. And that actually takes the law and turns it on its head. The final thing I'd like to say is that the issue of voter ID. Now, I filed an amicus brief in the Indiana case attacking the voter ID on behalf of 29 scholars and historians across the country who said that basically a lot of good government reforms, which is what I think a voter ID bill is. And by the way, let's just call it like it is. The Justice Department was not asked to file a brief in the Indiana voter ID case. The most divisive issue of our time in the area of voting rights right now is voter ID. And the Bush administration politically jumped into that case. Sure, they have an interest in federal voting rights, but they didn't have to do it, and they certainly could have presented a more balanced argument for it. But the fact is, and I'll close with this, you have a better chance of being struck by lightning than you do finding a person impersonating another at the polls. And a photo ID isn't going to correct that one bit. You talk to any law enforcement officer and they'll tell you the technology's out there to make fake IDs as easy as the real ones. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll look forward to any questions that come later.